And I do think that that will be the big issue in the next couple of years. Does the world, country by country, choose to have the Chinese run things, or do they choose America or some mix? But I think it's a big mistake if we let the Chinese run the infrastructure of the Internet of the future. I think that, and I hope that President Trump in a second term does the equivalent of a Manhattan Project with high tech. For example, you know, we in America, we always assume, look, we invented the television age, we invented, you know, the telephone, we invented the computers. I mean, we are the high-tech kings of the world. But you have to keep reinvesting in technology or somebody else becomes a new high-tech king. And the Chinese have invested greatly in technology. They're not very good at inventing it, but they're great at buying it, stealing it, reproducing it. So I think the United States should do what we're good at. I mean, we're great inventors. We always have been.
Katie McFarland, so wonderful to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you. Oh, there we go.
And we're doing the fist bump, of course, for the benefit of our audience. Coronavirus is in the country. Can never be too safe. Well, listen, so you have this amazing book, Insider Look into the Trump White House Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. And you're promising to offer this kind of unvarnished look under the hood and how things happen. Tell me a little bit about, the inspiration behind what you're writing this book.
Okay, so I should explain who I am. I was in the Nixon, Ford, Reagan administrations, traditional Republican foreign policy expert.
That's right.
Belonged to the Council on Foreign Relations, all of those things, graduate degrees.
Yeah.
But I, in the last 10 years, have become very dissatisfied and really unhappy with the direction that the Republican Party was taking the American foreign policy community. And I thought that we were way too focused on the Middle East. We had missed the ball on focusing on China. And the United States needed to get off of Middle East oil. And all the stuff that sort of nobody was saying. But then Trump comes along. And I thought, well, here's this guy. I'm a foreign policy person. He's not. But he's the guy getting it all right. And so I was very intrigued. I started giving him some advice during the campaign. During the transition, he was elected, and I supported him for the following reasons. He understood that you needed to first fix the American economy, because without economic growth, we don't have any leverage over anybody. I think he secondly realized these endless wars in the Middle East, which we were not winning. We were expending American blood and treasure, and they were getting us not what we wanted. And then finally, they were focusing our attention so much on the Middle East and terrorism, which were important, but not the first priority. But the first priority should have been China, the growing threat of China, not only economic, but military and potentially digital, cyber threat. And we were ignoring all of that. So when Trump comes along and he says, China, 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 I'm going to make America win, I'm going to rebuild the military, I was very intrigued. So I went to work for him, and the Republican part, I was one of the only sort of major figures in the Republican foreign policy community to support him. And I think it was the right thing, because here's what he's done, and I was very honored to be in the Trump administration from the very beginning, from the transition from the early days, because what I did in my job as Deputy National Security Advisor was to review the Obama foreign policies and to redirect them across the board, and to take Trump's campaign promises, which were just kind of little lines here and there, and make them into coherent policies. So the policies were sort of driven by the following architecture. Number one, fix the American economy. Number two, encourage American fracking, so we could become not only independent of foreign oil and natural gas, but we could export it. We could be the new economic center for energy supplying to the world. And then he understood, to me, what was an important element that nobody else really had focused on, because he was a businessman. He realized that by the trade deficits that we had, that the Chinese need to sell more stuff to us than we need to sell to them. The Iranians need to sell more stuff than we need to sell to them. The Germans need to sell more stuff to us than we need to sell to them. So we could go to those countries with a trade war and say, we want you to renegotiate our trade agreements. They're lopsided. You have very high tariffs against our stuff. You're taking advantage of our generosity that we did 50, 60, 70 years ago. We just want a new deal. We don't want no trade agreement. We don't want no security. We just want a fair one, a reciprocal one. And he understood that that would be the leverage. So I was very happy to be part of that. and to create a new foreign policy around it. And I think it's been remarkably successful. Now, the American economy is the strongest economy in the world. We have pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. It was a flawed deal, and Trump understood that the economic weapon was far more powerful than any military weapon would be against them. We're, Afghanistan and Iraq, we're not in the Middle East fighting wars we can't win. And he's been the first president to stand up to China, and I think quite effectively so.
This is actually quite interesting because my recollection is that pretty much every presidential election cycle, China is an issue. But for some reason, right, what made you realize that Trump was serious about China?
Well, because the thing about Trump, he says a lot of stuff. But watch what he does. And what he always does is he's the tough guy stuff. He's a negotiator. He saw that you could make deals there. And I thought he was willing to stand up to China, and he did. And he was willing to play real hardball with China, using the economic weapon. Again, using the trade war weapon, going to them saying, you can't do this militarily, you can't do this economically. And knowing that with time, it would have far more effect on their economy than it would on ours. And I think that was the right thing to do. It's been, not completely successful, but phase one is done. I think phase two trade agreement with the Chinese will be in the second term. And then chances are that rewrites the world sort of economic trading situation, not just with China and the United States, but with China and all the other countries in the West.
So since we're talking about this foreign policy now, there's a lot of folks that believe that China will never agree to any deal that isn't explicitly better for itself. They won't agree to a fair deal ultimately, even though they might do a phase one, which seems fair. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think they will agree to what they have to agree to.
Okay.
And they're not going to give us anything. We've given them, it's been China first, as America's had not an America first, it had a China first policy for years. And as a result of our generosity in the 80s and 90s, we gave them preferential trade terms, we gave them preferential investment terms, they stole our technology if they couldn't buy it. And what I think Trump is planning to do, or what I hope he plans to do in his second term, is to take the new trade agreements he's gotten. So we have Canada, Mexico, the United States, we have South Korea and Japan. I think we will get a new trade agreement with the Brits now that they're out of the European Union. Those negotiations are ongoing.
And they decide to do something with Huawei.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But so I think Trump gets them all together, and then we all have the same complaints with the Chinese, particularly over technology stuff. And we go to them and say, we are now representing 70% of the world's trade, and you have no choice. You really have to deal with us in a different term. Now, you mentioned Huawei, and the reason I think that's an important issue is because the Chinese, in their foreign policy, if you look sort of what they've done, so they've done militarily what they've done is they're building a strong military blue water navy. They've taken the South China Sea and they're claiming it now as an internal Chinese lake. They've created a series of ports that go from Asia through South Asia to the west coast of Africa and up to the Middle East. So they have a maritime trade route. They're creating a land trade route called One Belt, One Road, which is to take land routes that go from Asia all the way to Central Asia into the Middle East, on up to Europe, and then potentially over into Africa. And so what they're trying to do is create, I think, the equivalent of what the Roman Empire did. A trading bloc, a trade route that they control, Chinese terms, Chinese standards, and then all the countries, the 70 countries, for example, along One Belt, One Road, then have to play by China's rules. So I think they're doing that, number one. Number two, what they're doing is they have something called Made in China 2025, where they have said that their goal is to dominate the 10 technologies of the future. So it's everything from artificial intelligence to robotics, things like self-driving cars, microprocessors, bioengineering, and so anyway, a whole series of things that are the technologies of the future. Huawei, which you've just mentioned, is a large part of that, because Huawei is the Chinese company that plans to build the infrastructure of the Internet of the future. It's called 5G. Now, a lot of people think that just means, we're going to download movies faster. It's going to be great. We don't have to wait for Netflix. But what it really does is the Chinese will then control the infrastructure of the internet, all communications, and because of the way the Chinese government and military are structured, they have the right to go into Huawei's infrastructure and listen into every phone call, every email, every text message, everything that is going to travel, every bit of communication, every cloud communication that's going to travel on this infrastructure, the Chinese have access to. Now, I don't want to give that to anybody, but I sure as heck don't want to give that to the Chinese. And I do think that that will be the big issue in the next couple of years. Does the world, country by country, choose to have the Chinese run things, or do they choose America or some mix? But I think it's a big mistake if we let the Chinese run the infrastructure of the internet of the future.
You know, I love this conversation. We'll talk about the book in a moment.
You don't think people are so
keep
in
going.
the weeds with this?
No. This is, I mean, a lot of our readers are coming to us about China, of course. You know,
But I write about this a lot in my book.
Oh.
Where I talk about the foreign policy and the reason I didn't like the other guys and I did like Trump, and then the Trump foreign policy. But the fact that the United States, and it was not, I want to preface it by saying it wasn't a dumb idea initially, but we look at Europe. After World War II, Europe was devastated, Japan was devastated. After the Korean War, Korea was devastated. So we helped them all. We gave generously, we had trade agreements which subsidized their economic development. We had security agreements where we underwrote most of the mutual security agreements. And it was with a very deliberate idea that we will help them, encourage them to build modern societies, strong economies. They will be our allies. They will be our trading partners. They will be open and democratic societies. And it worked. It was a great success. So much so we don't have to keep subsidizing them. We assumed the same thing would happen with China, and it did not. So we, in the 1980s, 90s, year 2000, when they joined the World Trade Organization, we assumed that the Chinese, as they developed a middle class, became more prosperous, would also be like Korea, Japan, Germany, the European countries, that they would be a more open society, they would be a more open economy, and they, in fact, did just the opposite. They have become a far more authoritarian country and a far more closed and manipulated economy. So we bet wrong on China, and it was time to, I think, to reassess and to renegotiate, not politely asking for something, because the Chinese are going to play real hardball.
Yes.
But you need to play hardball back.
So tell me, how do you think America can catch up in 5G to compete with Huawei, which is already, I think
already well
at
established,
least in 70
and
countries.
Yeah, and also underwritten economically, massively underwritten.
Yeah.
So it's cheaper. But why is it cheaper? Because the Chinese government is underwriting it. I think that, and I hope that President Trump in a second term does the equivalent of a Manhattan Project with high tech. For example, we in America, we always assume, look, we invented the television age, we invented, the telephone, we invented the computers. I mean, we are the high-tech kings of the world. But you have to keep reinvesting in technology or somebody else becomes a new high-tech king. And the Chinese have invested greatly in technology. They're not very good at inventing it, but they're great at buying it, stealing it, reproducing it. So I think the United States should do what we're good at. I mean, we're great inventors. We always have been. So to have an American government policy where we encourage, I'm not a big government person, but I think in this case, tax incentives to companies that do raw research, R&D, government research and development, tax incentives to kids who want to get an education but don't want to major in French literature, they want to major in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and to have an all-of-government approach and to encourage and make it cool again to study math. My daughter went to the Naval Academy, and she's got an engineering degree. And every kid in America can get an engineering degree. Maybe they have other specialties, but they should have fundamental understandings of those things. And with that, I think the United States we don't necessarily need to catch up, we just need to maintain and continue to advance in a whole series of areas. So my goal for America, foreign policy, domestic policy, more than anything, would be to invest in the technologies of the future and then close the barn door. Don't let anybody steal it. Don't give it away. Don't make it a condition. The Chinese make it a condition of investment, U.S. investment in Chinese companies, that we have to share their technology. No, we're not going to share the technology. If we want to invest in China, well, guess what? We're going to go invest in Vietnam instead. So I think that we play tough in that regard, and to maintain the technology high ground that we have always enjoyed.
So, you seem very positive on the administration. We're obviously a big part of it, and especially on the foreign policy side. Why did you leave?
Well, I left for two reasons. Well, one reason was because my immediate boss, General Flynn, was fired 3 weeks into the administration, and then a new boss came, and he decided he wanted his own people. It took him about 5 months to find a replacement, but President Trump asked me to go to Singapore as the ambassador instead, which I was eager to do. But what happened to me was I got caught up in the Mueller investigation and the Russia investigation, and although I'd never met any Russians, I had no dealings with any Russians, I was, I believe, targeted by the Mueller investigation, the FBI, the people who wanted to take Trump down, and they targeted the people around Trump to try to get them to plead guilty for crimes they didn't commit, to implicate Trump in crimes he didn't commit. What we've seen in the impeachment investigation is very similar. So I got caught up in all of that. It took me about 6 months to break free of it, and I refused to plead guilty to crimes I didn't commit. And as a result, I really was taken through the ringer financially and by the Justice Department. But anyway, you don't need to worry about those things. That's over, it's done. But at that point, I really needed to get off and do some thinking of my own, and I did. And I think I've written a very thoughtful book, wrote it all by myself. I didn't have some ghostwriter do it. And it's a very thoughtful explanation of what I've just told you, why I rejected traditional Republican foreign policy, why I embraced Trump's ideas, what happened in the early days of the Trump administration to put this foreign policy into place, economic and foreign policy and international economic policy into place. But then finally, what I realized, which is I think what a lot of Americans feel, that the country's in a weird place right now. I mean, we're all fighting like cats and dogs. We're doing this, the fist bump thing because everybody's arguing over whose fault. Instead of fixing it, we're all arguing over whose fault coronavirus is. We're in a very bad place as a nation. Now, that means it's the end of America? Some people think it is. Some people think it's never been worse. But I did a lot of reflecting, a lot of reading, and what I concluded was America, because we are a dynamic and changing and nimble society, we need a government that keeps up with us, and government by its very nature doesn't. It digs in. It's a status quo. It wants to reinforce privileges and positions and powers that it's had before. And yet, so like governments going along like this, but the American society, we're having, immigration, we're having technological advancement, we're having, geographic movement, demographic movements, and so we're growing away from the government. The government can't solve our problems. So at this point, say every 40 years, we throw this government out, we get new guys. And I think that's what we've done ever since the founding of the Republic. And I think that's what we're going through now.
As you say, when I was reading about your book, because I haven't had a chance to read it yet, I see you're trying to frame all of this in a historical context,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, give me a thumbnail of what that means.
Okay, so I think the Republican Party had a civil war in 2016, and the war I fought, right? Donald Trump versus traditional Republicans. Trump won. The Democrats are having a civil war right now. Bernie Sanders versus traditional Democrats. My guess is Bernie Sanders wins. What both of those tell you is that the country at large doesn't like the guys in Washington. They aren't getting the job done. They want to kick the bums out. And so I think that what we're seeing is a grassroots national American movement. And we have these. We had it. That was what the American Revolution was about. That was what the Jacksonian Revolution was about in the 1830s. That's what the Civil War was about. That's what Teddy Roosevelt and the Industrial Revolution was about. That was what happened after the Great Depression and World War II, the Reagan Revolution, and now the Trump Revolution. I think that it's a very healthy thing. I was collateral damage, and I don't like that. But I think it's really how America reinvents ourselves. And no other country does that. Everybody else, they rise, they shine, like the British Empire, for example, and then they decline. Or the Persian Empire, they rise, they shine, they decline. The Roman Empire, what does America do? We rise, we shine, we decline a little bit. We reinvent ourselves, we rise again and shine. And I think that is the heart of American exceptionalism. You're Canadian. You came to America to create a new life for yourself, right? You reinvented yourself. Everybody in America reinvents themselves. But the value and genius of America is that the nation reinvents itself.
You know, actually, it's kind of true what you're saying about me. I think I'm one of these rare American exceptionalist Canadians. Well, you know, actually, since we were talking about China, you do mention that you have some thoughts on the president's relationship with a few of these characters in Asia, like Xi Jinping,
Right.
speaking of China. So tell me, I would love to know what Revolution says about Xi Jinping and that relationship.
Okay, so let me tell you the story that I tell in my book, and it's okay, I've cleared it with President Trump, I can talk about it. So at the beginning of the Trump administration, the Chinese sent over a Chinese senior delegation to arrange a summit meeting with President Trump. Now, normally these meetings with the Chinese, especially the Chinese, but all presidential meetings are very carefully choreographed. And so they start out at the low level and they think, well, these are the items on our agenda, what's on your agenda, and then, well, we're going to talk about this, we're going to agree on that, and they kind of move up the food chain. And so by the time the head guy is meeting the other head guy, everything's already been decided. So Trump wants to do it completely differently. He's a real estate guy from New York. And he's used to dealing, in New York, by the way, I'll explain it to you. New York, the real estate empires are owned by families. And it's the patriarch who's the boss. They own the whole company. There are no stockholders. And the family members work for the boss. And the boss makes all the decisions. So when one boss of one real estate empire works with the boss of another real estate empire, the two bosses, they shake hands, they negotiate, they play tough, but they make the decisions. So in Trump's experience, only the top guy can make the big, bold choices and the big, bold decisions. So the Chinese delegation comes to the White House and meets in my office, and they've got their briefing papers, and they say, well, these are our vital national interests, tick, 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 tick. And then they sort of waited for me, and I said, well, President Trump would prefer to meet Xi Jinping personally and then get a sense of the relationship, and then we can deal with these issues. They were so frustrated. I mean, the Chinese leaders expected my list. I didn't have a list. And I said, instead, let's have a meeting, and they'll see if they get along. Well, you know, for the Chinese, that's the last thing they want. An unscripted meeting with a boss? You know, anything could happen. Anyway, so we did have that unscripted meeting with Trump and Xi Jinping, and the way I explained it to the Chinese was, you know, at the beginning of the US-China relationship in the 1970s, Nixon went to China in 1972. I worked for Henry Kissinger when he went in 1971. And when the leaders of our two countries met, they didn't haggle out, you know, the little issues of this or that or trade or whatever. They talked about big picture stuff. Where does China want to be? Where does America want to be in 20, 50 years? I said, so Trump's like that. He wants to have a talk and a dialogue with Xi Jinping at the very highest level first, so that then it will set the stage for what happens next. Chinese guys didn't like it, but they went along with it. So fast forward, Trump is in Mar-a-Lago with Xi Jinping for the first US-China summit meeting. They're having their meeting, everything is going along nicely. But Trump had arranged to have, this was going to be the weekend that we bombed the Syrian chemical weapons, where chemical weapons were used in Syrian oil attacks, air attacks against their own people. So Trump made the decision before going to Mar-a-Lago, we're going to bomb the Syrian fields where the chemical weapons were used, and I'm going to go on to my meeting with Xi Jinping. And so Trump's carrying on the meeting. I'm in the Situation Room with the Vice President. Trump's acting like nothing's happening. We know that the American destroyers are about ready to launch the Tomahawk missiles into Syria. And we're nervously looking, everything goes fine. We give President Trump the word, everything's fine. He's in the middle of a state dinner with Xi Jinping. So while they're having dessert, Trump leans over to the Chinese president, who doesn't like unscripted moments, and he says, we've just bombed and destroyed the airfields in Syria, which were used for chemical weapons attacks against the Syrian people. It was our red line, they crossed it, we've destroyed them. And so Trump says, and he would repeat the story for weeks afterwards, he said that the Chinese president looked at him, it was all done through an interpreter, and said, after the interpreter said, you know, this is what President Trump said, that Xi Jinping looked at him and says, repeat. And so Trump repeated it, the translator repeated it, and Xi Jinping hears it, and then he says, repeat again. At which point Trump offers him the beautiful chocolate cake and they had a great dinner. So I'm telling this very long story by way of saying that Trump wanted a personal relationship and personal diplomacy with the Chinese leader instead of the traditional old, let everybody in the staff agree on this and that and the other thing, because Trump wanted a more bold relationship.
And we're going to finish up in a moment here, but I just, in the Chinese community, there was a lot of discussion about this, whether this was actually intentional timing and so forth. It sounds like it wasn't, right? But it definitely
it wasn't unintentional.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Trump understood the risks of if it had gone wrong.
Yeah.
With the whole world watching and the
Right.
Chinese leader in the most important
Right.
summit meeting and the most important relationship.
Suffice it
So
to
was a
say, it
risk.
wasn't something that Xi Jinping expected
No, it
an
was a bit
American
of a
leader
surprise.
to do. Yeah, exactly. So very much set the tone for the future, I think.
Yeah, it puts Trump in. The advantage that Trump has is he likes to be unpredictable. He's actually not. He's very thoughtful when he acts unpredictable. But the Chinese like everything in a certain order and it's predictable, and we've all agreed on this in advance. And so for Trump, it's a distinct advantage in his negotiating because he could come out of anywhere with them. He could make any different proposal, and it puts them off balance. They're very good at these scripted negotiations. They think of everything, they research every angle, but how do they prepare for a negotiation with Trump? And when Trump doesn't want to engage, it goes nowhere. So I think it's actually for him in this particular relationship a distinct advantage.
Okay, so Katie McFarland, Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. I'm going to be reading it. Such a pleasure to have you.
It's a great pleasure to read the fist bump again. Okay, thank you very much.